April 11, 1945, 0530 hours. The silence didn't break, it shattered. It started with the 155mm long toms from the rear, a rhythmic, guttural thumping that felt like it was punching holes right through the atmosphere. You don't just hear artillery that close, you feel it in your teeth. The shells screamed overhead, a sound like wet silk being ripped apart by a giant. And then the world in front of us simply detonated. Huge, towering pillars of black soot and frozen earth erupted along the perimeter, blooming like lethal flowers. The earth didn't just shake, it buckled. Concrete anti-tank teeth were snapped like dry kindling. The concussion waves hit us in the chest, hot enough to knock the wind out of a grown man, over and over again. Then came the Shermans. The roar of the Continental radial engines drowned out everything else. They moved forward, heavy steel treads grinding against the shattered stone, a mechanical screech of metal on metal that set every nerve on edge. They didn't slow down for the obstacles. They crushed them. You could hear the high-tension snap of the electric barbed wire fences as the tanks rolled over them, the wires whipping through the air like lethal snakes. The smell of diesel exhaust and scorched ozone filled the air, thick enough to taste. Suddenly, the German side woke up. The MG-42s started their song. It's not like a regular machine gun. It sounds like a buzzsaw, a continuous, terrifying rip that shears the air into ribbons. You could see the tracers, long, flat streaks of burning red phosphorus stitching across the kill zone. They hit the mud and sent up tiny geysers of wet dirt. They hit the armor of our lead tanks and sparked off in a shower of white-hot magnesium light. The sound of those 8mm rounds snapping past your ears, crack, zip, meant they were inches away. If you heard the crack, it hadn't hit you yet. "Move! Keep your heads down! Move up!" the sergeants were screaming, but you could barely hear them over the staccato rhythm of the BARs and the M1 Garands. Ping! The sound of an empty clip ejecting was lost in the chaos. We hit the first line of trenches. It was a chaotic blur of fire and steel. The German defenders were pouring lead from the corner pillboxes, the muzzles of their guns flashing white-blue in the morning gloom. Every few seconds, a phosphorus shell would hit a bunker, and a gout of liquid fire would roar outward, turning the gray air into a furnace. Then, the grenades started. The Germans were throwing potato mashers, those long-handled sticks, and they made a sharp, high-pitched crack that echoed inside your skull. Our guys were tossing Mark II pineapples back. Thump, thump, thump. The explosions hasted the mud into the air, mixing with the smoke until you couldn't see 5 feet in front of your face. You just aimed for the muzzle flashes. The heavy 50 caliber machine guns on the tank decks were chugging now, a slow, rhythmic thump, 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 thump that sounded like a giant hammer hitting an anvil. They were shearing the tops off the wooden guard towers, wood splinters flying like shrapnel, sending the structures leaning at impossible angles until they collapsed under their own weight. Every foot of ground was a struggle of kinetic energy. A German 88mm anti-tank gun barked from a hidden position. The shell traveling so fast you saw the impact before you heard the report. It slammed into a Sherman's turret, a horrific clang of steel piercing steel, followed by a secondary explosion that blew the hatch clean off. Smoke, black and greasy, spiraled up. But the line didn't stop. The infantry pushed through the gaps, boots slipping in the churned-up slurry of blood and mud. We were in the trenches now, close-quarters mechanical violence. The rapid-fire chatter of the Thompson submachine guns, rat-tat-tat-tat, clearing out the dugouts. The smell of cordite was overwhelming, stinging the eyes and burning the throat. Hand to hand meant the dull thud of a rifle butt against a helmet, the scrape of a bayonet against a belt buckle, the frantic cycling of bolts. There was no time for aiming, only reacting. A German soldier lunged with a folding spade. A 1911 Colt 45 barked twice, the heavy slugs knocking him backward into the slush. The air was a solid mass of flying metal. Shrapnel from the mortar rounds was whistling through the air, a low-pitched whir that ended in a sickening thud when it found a target. The ground was littered with spent brass, thousands of hot casings crunching under our boots. The vibration of the heavy armor nearby made the very mud dance. Another bunker exploded, a direct hit from a tank's 75mm main gun. The pressure wave blew the doors off their hinges and sent a cloud of gray dust and pulverized concrete billowing out. We kept pushing. The fire grew more intense as we neared the inner perimeter. The MG-42s wouldn't stop. They were swapping barrels, the red-hot steel glowing in the dark as they continued to spray the field. We suppressed them with a wall of fire. Every Garand and BAR opening up at once, a concentrated sheet of lead that chewed the tops of the sandbags into dust. We threw more grenades, the explosions overlapping until it became one continuous roar that blocked out all human sound. The smell of burning rubber, hot oil, and scorched earth was the only thing left in the world. The tanks pivoted on their tracks, the sound of the metal links grinding against each other like the teeth of a monster. They crushed the perimeter gates, the heavy iron hinges snapping with the sound of a pistol shot. We flooded through the breach, our rifles leveled, the muzzles still smoking, our breath coming in ragged gasps that tasted like sulfur and ash. The resistance was fanatical. Sniper fire from the high chimneys of the camp's outskirts began to pick at us, the bullets snapping against the brickwork and sending red dust flying. We responded with a flamethrower. A long, hissing jet of liquid fire arched through the air, clinging to the stone, turning the sniper's nest into a roaring inferno in seconds. The heat was so intense, it singed the hair on our arms from 20 yards away. There was no pause, no room to breathe. The mechanical grind of the war machine was in full gear, a relentless cycle of reload, fire, and advance. The clatter of the treads, the roar of the engines, the scream of the shells, and the never-ending rip of the machine guns created a symphony of pure destruction. We were no longer men. We were just parts of the machine, moving forward into the wall of fire, clearing the way with lead and high explosives, one bloody yard at a time, until the outer defenses were nothing but a smoldering ruin of twisted wire and shattered stone. The 75mm armor-piercing round hit the center of the main iron gate with a sound that felt like a sledgehammer hitting a massive anvil right inside my ear. The iron didn't just bend, it disintegrated into a cloud of jagged black shrapnel that whistled through the air, shredding everything in its path. One half of the gate groaned as its massive hinges snapped like dry twigs, the heavy metal slab collapsing into the mud with a wet, earth-shaking thud. We didn't wait for the smoke to clear. We surged forward, boots slipping on the slick mixture of slush and fresh oil leaking from a crippled half-track. The moment we crossed that threshold, the world turned into a vertical wall of lead. From the upper floors of the stone guardhouses, the MP-40s opened up in a synchronized roar. It was a crossfire. I could see the muzzle flashes, bright staccato sparks of white and yellow against the gray stone. Bullets chewed into the ground at our feet, kicking up sprays of gravel and frozen dirt. Thud, 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 thud. They were hitting the sandbags we were using for cover, the burlap tearing open and spilling sand like bleeding wounds. "Satchel charge! Get it on that door!" The command was nearly lost in the mechanical scream of the battlefield. One of our guys lunged forward, his back hunched under the weight of his gear, as he pitched a block of C composition toward the base of the primary guard tower. The explosion was a sharp, high-pressure crack that sucked the air out of my lungs. A split second later, the heavy oak door was gone, replaced by a jagged hole and the billowing curtain of orange flame. We moved in before the debris had even finished falling. Inside the guardhouse, the air was thick with pulverized stone and the bitter, acrid tang of cordite. It was room to room, second by second violence. My Thompson was vibrating in my hands, the .45 caliber slugs thumping into the wooden partitions, sending splinters flying like tiny daggers. We rounded a corner and met a wall of fire. An SS guard was hunkered down behind a heavy desk, his Luger barking. Pop, pop, pop. The brass casings dancing on the floor. I squeezed the trigger, a 5-round burst that caught the edge of the desk, wood exploding in a shower of dust before the heavy slugs found their mark. There was no time to reload before the next one was on us. It was a frantic, desperate scramble. A German soldier lunged from a side office, his rifle swung like a club. The wood of his stock splintered against my shoulder, a numbing jolt of pain, but I drove the muzzle of the Thompson into his chest and fired until the bolt locked back on an empty chamber. The metallic clack of the empty mag hitting the stone floor was the only thing I heard for a heartbeat before the next grenade went off. Outside, the Sherman tanks were still working. They couldn't fit through the narrow inner gaps, so they just started leveling the structures. I heard the whistle of a high explosive shell, then the deafening crump as the top tier of the guard tower simply ceased to exist. Stones the size of human heads came raining down, smashing through the roofs of the smaller sheds. The .50 caliber machine gun on the tank deck was relentless, a slow, heavy chunk, 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 chunk that was systematically deconstructing the brickwork of the sniper nests, turning solid walls into red dust and rubble. We pushed deeper into the administrative block, the heart of the entrance complex. Every doorway was a potential death trap. We used the cook and toss method with the Mark II pineapples. Pull the pin, count to 2, and let the iron fly. The explosions inside the confined hallways were devastating. The pressure waves blew out every window in the building simultaneously, a rain of glass shards tinkling onto the pavement outside like deadly rain. We followed the blast, boots crunching on the glass, our muzzles sweeping the smoke for any sign of movement. The Germans were retreating into the basement levels, firing back over their shoulders, the rhythmic clack-clack of their bolts cycling, the sharp crack of the Kar 98Ks. It was a constant, overlapping wall of noise. One of our BAR men stood in the center of the hallway and just let it rip. The Browning automatic rifle roared, a heavy, rhythmic pounding that chewed through the plaster walls and sent the defenders diving for cover. I could see the tracers glowing bright green as they ricocheted off the iron pipes along the ceiling, showering the hallway in sparks. We hit the final staircase leading to the courtyard. A German MG-34 was set up at the top, its bipod dug into the stone. The rate of fire was so high, it sounded like a single, long scream of metal. We couldn't move. The bullets were hitting the edge of the stone stairs, chipping away the masonry until clouds of white dust blinded us. "Frag out!" 2 grenades went up at once. They bounced off the top lip of the stairs. The double explosion muffled the machine gun's roar for just a second. We took the gap. We sprinted up the stairs, our lungs burning with the smell of smoke and sulfur. It was point blank now. The machine gunner was trying to clear a jam, his hands fumbling with the hot metal. A burst from a Garand took him down. We scrambled over the sandbags, the hot brass from the MG-34 burning through my fatigues as I stepped on the pile of spent casings. The courtyard was a killing field. Crossfire from the inner barracks was sowing a pattern of death across the open space. We stayed low, hugging the base of the brick walls. The sound of the Panzerfaust hitting the lead Sherman at the gate echoed through the camp. A hollow whoomph, followed by a secondary roar as the tank's ammunition began to cook off. The heat from the burning tank was a physical weight, pushing against us even from 50 yards away. But there was no stopping. We had to silence the barracks. We moved in a staggered line, laying down a base of fire that didn't allow the defenders to lift their heads. Ping, ping, ping. The M1 clips were ejecting in a rhythmic cycle. We were burning through ammunition at a terrifying rate. I grabbed a fresh magazine from my pouch, my fingers slick with sweat and grit, and slammed it into the Thompson. The bolt snapped forward with a satisfying, oily clink. A group of guards tried to break for the secondary inner gate. We caught them in the open. The combined fire of 3 Thompsons and a BAR cut through the air, the heavy slugs hitting with the sound of wet laundry being slapped against a stone. They went down in a heap of gray wool and leather. We didn't slow down to check. We were already turning our fire toward the heavy steel doors of the main block. The air was a swirling vortex of ash, spent paper from the offices, and the black smoke from the burning motor pool. The noise was a physical entity, a roar that vibrated the very marrow of my bones. Every time a tank fired its main gun, the world turned white for a fraction of a second. Every time a grenade went off, the ground jumped under our boots. We were no longer thinking. We were just a series of violent reactions, a collective machine of fire and steel grinding its way through the last remnants of the gate's defense. The gate was ours, but the meat grinder was only just beginning to turn. The yard was a funnel of death. The moment we stepped past the smoldering ruins of the main gate, the air didn't just carry bullets. It felt like the air itself had been replaced by flying lead. To our left, a long brick barracks erupted in a rhythmic sequence of muzzle flashes. The German snipers were perched in the rafters, the Kar 98Ks cracking like whips. Crack, snap, crack, snap. The bullets were punching holes through the corrugated metal siding of the supply sheds next to us, the sound echoing like hammers on an anvil. "Flamethrower! Get that nozzle up here, now!" The order was a hoarse bark, barely audible over the mechanical scream of the battle. The operator surged forward, the heavy tanks on his back sloshing with thickened gasoline. He squeezed the grip. A terrifying hiss of pressurized fuel, proceeded a liquid roar of orange flame that arched 60 feet through the air. It hit the barracks windows, and the world turned into a furnace. The heat was a physical blow to the face, singeing eyebrows and sucking the oxygen out of our lungs. Within seconds, the stone walls were blackened, and the fire began to eat the wooden roof beams with a ravenous, crackling hunger. We didn't stop to watch it burn. We moved. The heavy 50 caliber machine gun on the lead Sherman, the one that had just smashed through the inner fence, began its slow, methodical pounding. Thump, 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 thump. Each round was the size of a man's thumb. It wasn't just killing, it was deconstructing the environment. I watched as the heavy slugs tore through a concrete guard post, turning the solid blocks into a fine white powder and jagged shrapnel. The German MG-42 inside was silenced mid-burst, the metal receiver of the gun literally sheared in half by the kinetic force. The resistance moved to the secondary administrative block, a heavy 3-story stone building. They had sandbagged the balconies. From above, they rained down potato masher grenades. The air was filled with these spinning wooden sticks. Boom, boom, boom. The concussions were so tight and frequent, they felt like they were trying to peel the skin off my bones. Mud, gravel, and pieces of gray wool uniform were hasted into the air. We were pinned against the base of the wall, the stone above our heads chipping and exploding as a barrage of MP40 fire raked the masonry. Tank! On the balcony! Range 50! The Sherman's turret whined, the heavy gears grinding as it tracked upward. The muzzle blast from the 75mm gun was a shockwave that flattened the grass for 20 yards. The shell hit the balcony dead center. The entire front face of the second floor didn't just fall, it disintegrated. A cloud of red brick dust and pulverized mortar billowed outward, masking everything in a choking, gritty fog. Through the haze, I saw the distorted silhouettes of the last defenders falling through the debris, their weapons clattering against the pavement like discarded toys. We breached the final block. It was a labyrinth of narrow corridors and heavy steel doors. Every corner was a point-blank execution. We used the M1 Garand like a spear, firing from the hip as we rounded the turns. Bang, 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 bang! The recoil kicked into my shoulder, a familiar, bruising jolt. We threw a phosphorus grenade into a communications room. The explosion wasn't a bang, it was a wet, muffled crump, followed by a blinding white glare that burned even through closed eyelids. The smell of burning chemicals and melting copper wire was suffocating. In the basement, the final pocket of resistance held out behind a heavy iron gate. They were firing through the bars with Lugers and Mausers. The confined space turned the sound of every shot into a deafening thunderclap. Pop, pop, pop! The bullets ricocheted off the stone floors, whining as they zipped past our helmets. We didn't have a clear shot. Bazooka, bring it down here. The loader slid the rocket into the tube, his hands shaking as he wired the contact. Whoosh! The backblast scorched the paint off the wall behind us. The rocket hit the iron gate, and the explosion was so violent in that small space that it blew our eardrums. The gate was twisted into a pretzel of blackened metal, the hinges torn clean out of the stone. We flooded the room. The last of the guards were scrambling for their sidearms, but we were faster. The roar of the Thompson, rat-tat-tat-tat-tat, cut the air into ribbons. The heavy 45 slugs hammered into the wooden crates and the men behind them, knocking them backward with the force of a physical punch. Spent brass casings flooded the floor, a literal carpet of hot metal that crunched under our boots. Suddenly, the firing stopped, but the noise didn't. The camp was a symphony of destruction. To our right, a fuel dump had caught fire, and the barrels were cooking off. Whir, bang, launching into the air like jagged, flaming rockets. The Sherman tanks were still prowling the perimeter, their treads screeching as they crushed the last of the wooden watchtowers into splinters. The sound of the structures collapsing was like a forest being leveled by a hurricane. I stepped back outside into the main yard. The air was a thick, greasy soup of black smoke and white ash. My rifle barrel was so hot, I could see the heat waves shimmering off the steel, blurring my vision. The smell, that unforgettable, haunting mix of high explosives, scorched flesh, diesel, and old iron, was everywhere. It stuck to my uniform, my skin, my hair. The last German sniper in the high brick chimney was finally neutralized. A concentrated burst from a BAR, thud, 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 sent his rifle tumbling 3 stories down, the wood stock shattering on the cobbles below. Then, for the first time in hours, there was no outgoing or incoming fire. Only the sound of the fires, the hiss of a broken steam pipe somewhere in the laundry block, the low, heavy rumble of the tank engines idling, their exhaust pipes spitting blue smoke into the gray sky. The ground was a map of the violence. Thousands upon thousands of spent shells, mangled barbed wire that looked like a giant's bird nest, the charred skeletons of trucks. The impact craters from the 105mm shells were deep enough to hide a man, filled now with oily, black water. The stone buildings were no longer buildings. They were jagged teeth of masonry, weeping dust. I looked down at my hands. They were caked in a mixture of black carbon and red brick dust. My Thompson's bolt was fouled with grit, the metal scarred from the impacts of shrapnel. The silence that followed was louder than the battle. It was a heavy, suffocating weight. We stood there among the smoking ruins, our lungs still burning, our hearts still hammering against our ribs like trapped birds. The mechanical roar of the war had moved on, leaving behind only the wreckage and the fire. The gate was open. The defenders were gone. The machinery of the camp had been broken by the machinery of the war. The smoke began to clear just enough to see the inner barracks, the places the guns couldn't reach. And that was when the real silence started. The kind of silence that stays with you. The kind of silence that follows the most brutal, unyielding violence the world had ever seen. What I saw wasn't just the bodies. It was the absolute cold-blooded efficiency of the destruction. The way the steel and the lead had prioritized the erasure of everything in their path. The haunting wasn't in the noise. It was in what remained when the guns finally went cold.